It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our plenary speaker for this morning's session. Amy Skoczlas Cole is the Managing Director for Water with American Public Media, the organization many of us here in Minnesota would know as Minnesota Public Radio. Before taking this post, Amy was most recently sustainability consultant to Fortune 500 companies. She's also a former vice president for corporate social responsibility at Pentair and sustainability director at eBay. Amy will be speaking on a topic that I know many in this room think about often, communicating science for action. Please join me in welcoming Amy to the conference.
As Jeff said, I'm Amy Skoczlas Cole, and I have spent the last 20 years of my career at the intersection of environment, social change, and business. The first half of my career was actually in field-based conservation, where I traveled all over the world working with communities on economics and markets. I worked with the forestry industry and the agriculture industry in places where those industries were driving environmental destruction at unprecedented rates, in places like Brazil and Mexico and Indonesia. I combated illegal logging, tracked the rise of soy and palm oil, and helped coin the phrase conservation coffee. And you'll still see the results of that work on the side of most any bag of Starbucks coffee that you pick up. About a decade and a bit into my career, I decided that I needed a shift in perspective. So I went inside the halls and boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies. My first stop was eBay, a little company in Silicon Valley that at that time was actually the largest e-commerce platform in the world. There, I was really interested in how we could tap into the power of big data to understand how people made decisions, particularly consumer purchasing decisions. When my family moved to Minnesota 6 years ago, I joined Pentair as their first corporate social responsibility vice president. So I guess if you had to write a career objective statement for me, like at the top of a resume, I would say that the through line for me is chasing scale, chasing change at scale. So now, as Jeff said, I am 8 months into my newest adventure, which is leading the Water Impact Initiative, which we have now called the Water Main, at American Public Media, which we know as Minnesota Public Radio. And I'm really grateful to Jeff and Greg and everyone at the Water Resources Center for the invitation to be up here and talk about this topic of communicating science for action. Let me just take a poll real quick. How many of you in the audience are scientists? Oh my goodness, I wish we could get a shot of that. Hi, scientists. It's exciting to be here. How many of you would consider yourselves communicators? Oh, some, not as many. Interesting data point. So I guess there's a question that might be on the table. Since I went from unpopular career environmentalist to unpopular career shill for a corporation to really unpopular career joining the media industry, first you might wonder if I'm running for Congress next. I'm not, I promise. But why did I take this point in time to join the media industry? Well, it's because, like probably most of you, I'm really passionate about helping people understand and appreciate the issues and challenges that are facing us. As I think about change at scale, it's going to take a mainstream moment of the issues that we care about, and we have missed the mark as a community in delivering on that. If that sounds a little uncharitable or not particularly Minnesota nice, let me offer a few data points here. So about a year and a bit ago, Minnesota Public Radio conducted a survey that was actually fielded by Nielsen Research. And some of you have seen this. We've presented it at the Clean Water Council and other places, but the results were pretty stunning. Only 15% of Minnesotans believe that we have problems associated with water here. In fact, most Minnesotans would describe the quality of our water as good or excellent across the state. 80% would tend to agree with the statement that there are water problems in other parts of the country, but not here in Minnesota. And less than 15%, obviously, know that a majority of wells in southern Minnesota don't meet health standards for nitrates. Most of you are Minnesota Public Radio listeners, and so you're sitting here thinking, oh, we're a clever bunch, and I think that too. And you imagined that listeners probably polled significantly higher, right? No. A few percentage points. You are a very clever bunch that listen to Minnesota Public Radio News. But really, there was only a few percentage points of difference between those folks who said they didn't listen to us to those that did. So maybe that percentage change does show that we're making a dent in our ongoing coverage of water. We've been at it for a couple of years. And maybe it shows actually that people who listen to NPR are curious about water. That's what I think. But when you think about the sheer amount of focus and attention and resources and time that we have all collectively dedicated to raising the awareness of the state of water in our state, it's a little bit depressing, isn't it? We have a pretty new water reporter, Kirsty Marone. If you haven't met her or talked to her, she's based in Collegeville, and you're seeing a lot of reporting coming out of her as well as across our entire environment team. So what do I want to talk about today? I want to say first, I'm not a scientist, so don't type any scientific questions into that little app you've got going, please. You can answer those amongst yourselves. And I'm actually not a journalist, right? Important to say, but what I am is someone who has spent 20-some odd years trying to communicate about environmental issues. And so, what I have to share are really 4 simple points, 4 simple steps that I think, if taken together, will be an actionable plan for any of us who think about being more effective in communicating the things that we care about. So the too long didn't read version of this, right? Those of you that want to get up and get some coffee, because it really is early. Be curious. Be human. Be valuable. And show possibility. Let's unpack those one by one. Be curious. The science of psychology tells us that curiosity is what builds connections between people. Think about this in your daily life. Your life partner, your child, your best friend. Aren't you just intrinsically curious about what's going on with them, who they are, where they're going, what they need? And in following that curiosity, don't you find that you're constantly increasing your connection with them? Curiosity builds relationships. It drives innovation. It finds common ground. The greatest thing about curiosity is that scientists have it in abundance. It's the driver behind all research and scientific inquiry. So give yourselves a pat on the back for already exhibiting trait number 1. At NPR, our CEO talks all the time about the need, intense need, for us to be curious about our current audiences and our growing audiences. And he says that that's more important now than ever. Why? It's because curiosity is a superpower. It builds connections in a world that seems designed to drive us apart. And creating those connections is really what public media is all about. And here's the best kept secret. Connection is the prerequisite for communication. Let me say that again. Connection is the prerequisite for communication. That may seem backwards, but again, think about it in your daily life. The people, the brands, the media outlets that you pay attention to, that you're connected to, are the ones that influence you. So the reality is communications is a byproduct of connection. And how do we connect with others? By being curious. So this one, easy peasy for all the scientists here. Be curious about your audience. Be as curious about your audience when you're communicating as you are about your research, and you've got this one licked. Let me talk about what that looks like in real life. And I'll give you 2 examples from the world of journalism. Spaceship Media is an organization founded by 2 journalists, and right after this last presidential election, they brought 2 communities together that have been pitched against one another. People who voted for Donald Trump and people who voted for Hillary Clinton. In particular, they took women who voted for President Trump in Alabama and put them in a Facebook group with women from the San Francisco Bay Area who voted for Clinton. And then they poked that group with dialogue and engagement around hot-button topics that you could imagine, right? Healthcare, immigration, abortion, as well as other more personal topics like holiday traditions or reading habits or their relationships. The journalists provided information into that group when the group asked for it, and that's where reporting and the science of journalism came in. And what do you think happened? Over time, maybe the only place in the country where these 2 groups were actually in dialogue with one another. They were communicating, not talking past each other, and they began to see their counterparts as more than the vote that woman cast. Ultimately, when Spaceship Media was ready to wrap up this project, the women actually decided to keep the group going over time. 2 takeaways from my perspective on this one. Certainly, being curious has benefits to people. Those women have better perspective than they had when they went into it, so there was value add for them. But a really interesting thought about the role of information, the role of data, the role of those of us who provide it into the conversations that people are having, to provide it where the conversations are happening, when the conversation is happening, and in the context that the conversation is happening. Think about what that might look like in your work. Another example, kind of close to home, Minnesota Public Radio has been playing with and experimenting with crowdsourcing journalism for a very long time, since about 2003, if you can imagine that. They created something called the Public Insight Network for curious journalists to connect with knowledgeable sources. And I bet many of you in the room here are on the Insight Network. Today, there's about 230,000 people who share as sources for nearly 60 news organizations across the country. One example that stems from that kind of thinking is this project, I See Change. Has anybody heard of this, I See Change? If you work in the climate field, you might have. It's an online weather and climate journal that was started back in 2012 by a journalist in Colorado who wanted to help her listeners understand and identify, be eyewitness reporters, if you will, what was happening in the changes in the environment. It's grown into this hybrid citizen science social media platform that's very interesting, where people around the world document the changes that they are seeing with their own eyes, share their experience, and from there a conversation is started. And that's an opportunity, again, for those of us that provide information, for journalists and scientists, to step into the conversation in the context in which the conversation is happening. So here's an example from closer to home. This was last year, December. I think her name's Haley. I can't read the screen. Wrote in, it's December, and she's looking at Lake Superior, and the ice on Lake Superior has not yet frozen, which she finds to be unusual. And then here's Jay Austin, who most of us probably know from the Large Lake Observatory at the U. And he's coming into the conversation and saying, here's some context for why you see that happening. Last summer, the water temperatures in Lake Superior were higher than usual. That data point is going to be much more effective in helping people understand what's going on with temperatures in the Great Lakes than all of the talking at people that we could possibly do. Okay, so practicing what I preach a little bit, we're going to do an engagement exercise here. And so I'm going to need you to pull out your smartphones. Go ahead. And what you're going to do is you're going to text my name, Amy, A-M-Y, to the number that's on the screen, 63735. So you pull up your texting app, you type in 63735, and then as the number, and then you type in the word Amy. When you do that, you're going to get some on-screen instructions. And what this is an opportunity for you, the audience, to tell me what you would like me, the speaker, to talk about in my speech. Because I can't read 600 entries, we've narrowed it down to 3 options for you. Option A is communicating data. I can talk a little bit about communicating data. Option B is the power of narrative storytelling in science. How many of you think you're storytellers? And option C is social change campaigns and science. So these are your 3 options. All you have to do is type in A or B or C as your option. And then what I'm going to do is get those results, and then later on in my talk, I will integrate them in, and we will keep the conversation going via the water main, particularly on Twitter at the water main. So I will give you a minute to finish doing that. I see a lot of people still texting. While you're doing that, let me tell you a little bit more about the water main. Oh, and do me a favor, once you have finished texting, separate the magnetic pull between you and your phone, set it back aside. Really, really risky move for the speaker to ask people to pull out their phones in the middle of a talk, right? So let me tell you a little bit about the water main, which is the initiative that I run for Minnesota Public Radio. So why would Minnesota Public Radio be having a focus on water? Well, we've had it for a couple of years, and that's because our executives know and have heard from folks like you that water has this important but hidden role in society. Yes, it's an environmental issue, but it also connects to every aspect and way of our way of lives. Food, electricity, health, well-being. I don't have to list these for you. You are the ones that told us this, right? But we are so dependent on water. We also know people care about it. The Gallup Environment Poll consistently shows that water is the most important topic in people's minds from an environmental perspective. And in the world of water today, look at this. There is a ton of activity. I will say that I've observed from my spot, both in the environmental community as well as in the corporate world, that there are some silos, and that there's a lot of conversations happening amongst ourselves, but not necessarily connected. So there's this opportunity, we think, at Minnesota Public Radio for us to do what we do well, which is create common ground for new thinking, bring visibility and understanding to an important issue, expand perspectives, broaden horizons, and help take a complex topic and make sense of it. What does it look like? It's easy as 1, 2, 3, 4. I like numbers. Did you notice that? 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have one vision. I don't know if you can read the little headlines here, but one vision, a society that values clean and abundant water. We're going to implement against that vision with 2 goals. Our 2 goals are measurably and quantitatively raising what we call water IQ, which is how much people understand the issues and topics and solutions related to water, as well as, equally if not more importantly, water EQ, which is about our personal relationship and relevance of water in our daily lives. This is about unhiding water for people. Obviously, we think that this will position us, American Public Media, Minnesota Public Radio, as a great space to convene a national hub on water. For those of you who don't know, by the way, Minnesota Public Radio has a national arm as well, and with programming that you might be familiar with, like Marketplace or The Splendid Table. If you're a parent, I highly encourage you to check on Brains On, which is our science podcast for kids that is so much fun. So we've got a lot of tentacles reaching about 20 million people a week. So how are we gonna do that? How are we gonna raise IQ and EQ? Well, one thing we're going to do is connect water to the things that we know people care about and are tangible in their lives. I call this the water and strategy. Water and health, water and the economy, water and food. We think about 3 key audiences, and I'll admit this one is punting a little bit because these are really big groups of people, but certainly our current listeners have told us that we think that this is important. You can't here's a tip, you can't give a communications speech today with audiences and not include the word millennials. So I did. They're also an important and growing audience for us, not generally considered to be the core of public media, so we need to grow that. And then water influencers, all of you. And we're going to reach them with four strategies. The first is we're going to understand how people think about water better, and we're going to share that information. We're going to use all of our journalism platforms to inform folks about water issues. But going to EQ, that emotional connection, we're also going to connect people through conversations and engage folks through experiential opportunities and digital engagement. I won't go through these at length, but just to say, here's some of the early projects that we're teeing up. If you look at this and you see yourself as an expert or a resource for one of these projects, whether it's water and health and equity for communities that don't usually get their voices heard, or affordability of water, or the Mississippi River and the connections between Minnesota and Louisiana, let me or one of my colleagues know. We'd love to talk with you. Okay, so back to kind of our 3 steps, right? We were curious, and now we're going to be human. This also, do you see the build? Like, you're curious, you're scientists, you can do this. You're also human beings, so this one should come pretty easily for you. We assume, though, that what works to communicate for us works with others. And that's a particularly bad assumption if you're a scientist, because chances are you're going to be convinced by data and facts and figures to a degree that perhaps folks who have not pursued scientific careers may not be. So this might be one example where the golden rule just does not apply. Please do not communicate with others like you want to be communicated to. You know, because you've been curious about your audience, a bit about your audience. Let's meet them where they are. So how do we go about doing that? Well, here's a few tips. Ditch the jargon. Ditch the jargon. I'm not sure everyone understands even how much jargon there is. So I found this great blog by Dr. Diana Robson at Manitoba Museum. And she was poking fun of herself and her own blog writings. This is not scientific writing. She was looking back at her blogs. And she did a blog on translation. And she provided some translations that I'm going to read here. So, translation. So she writes, due to a technical error, some data was unusable. Translation, I dropped my laptop in a swamp. The first attempt at locating the rare species was unsuccessful. Translation, I couldn't figure out how to use my new GPS. The second attempt was also unsuccessful. Translation, we couldn't find the thing. The plant was located on the third field visit. Translation, the guy we hired to pilot the boat found it. And finally, wildlife interference prevented collection of additional data. Translation, a polar bear tried to eat me. I bet that's happened to some of you. This is a thing, really, truly. Scienceandpublic.com actually has a dejargonizer. You can actually cut and paste your text. This isn't for scientific literature, right? This is when you're trying to talk like a human. You cut and paste your scientific text into the little browser window that they have, and they will give you a rating of how jargony you are and which words are the most jargony. So there's a tool out there, also built by scientists, I will say. Second piece of advice, tell a story. Now, because you're scientists, I'm going to give you data to tell you why you need to tell a story. Normally, I would just tell a story about telling a story. Researchers from Madison have shown that there's a distinct difference in how people process the deductive scientific communication, that is the mainstay of your field, and narrative communication, the mainstay of my field, and suggests that narrative processing is generally more efficient. Narrative text was read twice as fast and recalled twice as well, regardless of how familiar the subject was with the topic. The research goes on to suggest that this is not due simply to the simplicity or the ease of the text, but that narratives offer benefits in the 4 ways that we process information as human beings. In being interested in it, in devoting time and attention to it, in thinking about it and then remembering it. And just to make my point about jargon, this is actually what the research says. In a great example of jargon, the research paper actually reads, "These benefits should not be assumed to come from simplicity, as coherent narratives demand a high level of complexity in both internal complexity and alignment to cultural and social expectancies. Instead, narratives seem to offer intrinsic benefits in each of the 4 main steps of processing information: motivation and interest, allocating cognitive resources, elaboration, and transfer into long-term memory." Whichever way you digested that information, in plain English or in scientific jargon, please take away the point that narratives matter. Finally, metaphors. If you have some time on your hands, Google metaphors and scientific communication and watch the debate swirl. It's really kind of fun. But the research, I think, is relatively clear that metaphors are actually very effective communication tools for bridging the gap. So there was research done on the concept of executive functioning, which scientists describe as our working memory, our inhibitions, and our mental resilience and flexibility. That's kind of a big concept if you're talking to a parent about their kid. So the research did some framing and quantitative assessment and found that the metaphor, the brain's air traffic control system, was really effective at bridging the gap between what the experts wanted to be communicated and what the layperson needed to understand. As I mentioned, this research was in the context of early childhood development, so it was really important to have this tool to have deeper dialogue with parents as well as with policymakers. Some other great metaphors that we probably use in our daily lives. Heat-trapping blanket to describe the effect of greenhouse gases on our atmosphere. Lock and key to describe the relationship between insulin and insulin receptors for diabetics. The image of a snowball rolling downhill to describe compound interest. And my favorite, perhaps, data is the new oil. Commodification and value of big data. Let me just check and see if we have a result. Do we have a result? Okay. So let's get back to what you're most curious about from the choices that I provided. And to give us this information, I am so excited to welcome Annie Baxter to the stage. Most of you will know Annie's voice, if not her face. She's been reporting for Marketplace for the last 3 years. Before that, she was an award-winning journalist with Minnesota Public Radio News. And I am so, so excited to say that Annie is my newest colleague as the content manager for The Waterman. So come on up, Annie.
Thank you for that. Are we on? Yep, we're on. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. It looks like the winner here is choice B, the power of narrative storytelling in science. And 197 of you voted. So thank you so much for that. That's
thank
great.
you. Thank you. What were the other 400 of you doing? Just like you liked it all? We can talk about it all in the question and answer. Thank you, Annie. And now that you know what Annie's looks like, in addition to what her voice sounds like, she'll be at our table on and off today, as I will be, along with my other colleagues, Linda Miller and Annie Anderson, and I hope you'll come by and talk to us. Okay, so I have to talk about storytelling. Yay! I was hoping you guys would pick this one, because it's something, as you could probably tell, I feel pretty passionate about. So I am going to read you a story that a scientist wrote. The scientist is Dr. Marcos du Satoy. He's a Spanish mathematician, and his field of research is prime numbers. I don't know about you, but I have no intrinsic interest or curiosity about prime numbers, except that they made my life difficult when I was trying to learn algebra. He wrote a book about the topic, and I should just mention, and you'll understand why I'm saying this. The topic of this is David Beckham, and Dr. Du Satoy is an Arsenal fan, so there may be some bias here. Even science has a bias when it comes to soccer, especially in Spain. So here is a little story that Dr. Du Satoy wrote to get people excited about prime numbers. In pubs and clubs and on internet sites, there has been much debate over the mystical meaning behind David Beckham's choice of the number 23 shirt to play for Real Madrid. So this is some years back. We all know who David Beckham is, right? Yeah, even though he's not a hockey player, we know who he is, right? Soccer player, came here to the galaxy for a bit. So he goes on to say, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Michael Jordan wore the number 23. Caesar was stabbed 23 times. 23 miles per hour is the maximum speed of an American crow. And let's not forget AA-23, the cell in which Princess Leia was held in the original Star Wars movie. This week, as Real Madrid prepares for a match against China's Dragon team, I'd like to back a new theory to explain why Beckham has plumped for number 23. As a member of Oxford University's Mathematical Institute and a football, aka soccer, fanatic, I feel moved to point out that many pundits seem to have missed the true significance of Beckham's choice. 23 is a prime number, the smallest with consecutive digits. Although many have said this in passing, few realize what a profound observation this is. Prime numbers are those indivisible numbers. So he's just told us what they are. They're nature's most important numbers because they are the atoms of mathematics. There's your metaphor. The hydrogen and oxygen of the world of numbers. Every number is built by multiplying prime numbers together, a fact obviously not missed by Real Madrid. The key building blocks of Real Madrid's team are all prime numbers. Carlos number 3, Zidane number 5, Raul number 7, Ronaldo number 11. So giving Beckham the 23 shirt is a clear indication that Real's president is intending to build on Beckham. But why did the cicadas choose 17, a prime number, for their hibernation? Scientists believe there is a predator that likes to crash their party and emerges periodically after a certain number of years. The cicadas found that by choosing a prime number cycle for their party, they could keep out of step with the predator more often than if they'd chosen a non-prime number like 15. For the cicadas, the primes are not just some abstract curiosity, but the secret to their survival. Perhaps Beckham, too, hopes that a prime number shirt might help him avoid getting another stray flying football in the eye. He goes on to give other examples in mathematical theory and a bunch of real-life examples, bringing in Sex and the City, astronomy, and Russell Crowe, all of which is fascinating, but I won't read to you in the interest of time. There, my friends, is how to tell a story with science in a way that captures the attention of even someone who doesn't give a flying fig about prime numbers. Okay, let me go on to the third step, be valuable. Be valuable is knowing your value, or more specifically, knowing how you're going to help your audience. Let's start with something a little controversial. Virtue does not sell. It never really has, and yet we all want to continue to frame things in this tired old right thing to do mantra. Sure, we might nominally list off different benefits or talk about a business case, but lying just under the surface of much, if not most, like the vastest majority of our communication, is this idea when it comes to human nature that there is a right thing to do, that there's a virtue. If anyone's here from the Natural Capital Project, ask them about the resistance they've found to the very simple concept about understanding the full value of society of our natural resources. Again, played out ad nauseum in online journals. Now, before you start a tweet storm at me talking about my misunderstanding of the nature of the human soul and good versus evil, let me be really precise in what I'm saying here. I believe, because I've seen it directly, that human individuals and humanity as a whole are capable of great and virtuous and selfless acts. But I also know that social science tells us a lot about the whys and the hows for those great and virtuous acts, the underlying motivations. We know, for instance, that people do things that conform with their sense of identity and their worldview, constructs that are essential to allowing our brains to process the vast amounts of information they have to filter. So now that you've been truly curious about your audience and you've learned more about them, and now that you've rid yourself of that protective armor of technical jargon, you can start to think about how you're going to serve your audience and meet a need. For decades, marketers have talked about value propositions. This is just that, thinking about the value proposition for your work. This concept, though, has broad applicability well beyond selling the next widget. It applies to our communications. So let me put up this chart. So Bain & Company translated basically a bit of Maslow's hierarchy of needs into an elements of value. We actually use this tool at Minnesota Public Radio as we're doing our business planning. And it basically has 4 levels, because I know those of you in the back probably can't see this, but the bottom level is the functional level, and it asks, what does this communication or this product or service do for me? And we can see that science is really great at providing almost all the answers and benefits in the functional area. Things like saving time, reducing risk, avoiding hassles, informing. These are all things that science is intrinsically great at. But now let's think about, just like with Maslow's hierarchy, moving up the pyramid to have impact. So the next group is the emotional. How does it make me feel? For instance, nostalgia is one of the things that's highlighted here. And if you think about it, nostalgia has been the core value that has been so behind the great partnership and the kind of unlikely allyship between hunters and fishermen and conservationists. That rod and reel club and bait and tackle club has been some of our best conservation allies. Another one that's really interesting to think about is badging, as it connects to science and action. This one really fascinates me. I did a lot of work on it while I was at eBay, and we did a lot of market research, both through surveys, but actually looking at how people behaved as well. And the goal was to get people to purchase more pre-owned product, which was eBay's niche at that time. Again, I know I'm dating myself a little bit, but that's okay. People overwhelmingly told us in their surveys that they would choose the environmentally preferable used product, all things equal. So that's kind of your standard right thing to do answer that you get when you issue surveys. In reality, though, when we looked at purchasing behavior, we found there were higher levels of motivation than the right thing to do. In particular, people wanted to be seen as making smart decisions, like, hey, look, I got this great expensive thing for a cheaper price, or they wanted to be seen as making a cool, hip decision. And most importantly, they wanted to be seen as doing it. They needed that badge. So the ramification for us was really astonishing. What we thought was one of our key selling points, that pre-owned goods on eBay were virtually identical to the new goods that you were going to buy in a big box store, actually turned out to be a negative for some segment of our audience, because they needed the distinction and the distinguishing badge of that product. Where it gets really interesting is when we move higher up the pyramid. How does it change my life? How does it change society? How do we provide hope? I would say that every one of you in this building is in the business of providing hope. So you are at the top of this pyramid and can communicate as if you are. So just as a note, you can find this great diagram online if you Google Bain & Company, or just Bain, Elements of Value Interactive. You have to put in the word interactive. And you can find it and you can play with it. And I think it's a great tool for helping each of us think about where we land. So the final step here. Here we are, the final piece of the puzzle, unlocking actions. Hopefully, what I've shared so far doesn't feel too out of the norm for what you do every day. Be curious, be a scientist, be human, be valuable, show possibility. I may have gotten to the point where I am asking you to do something that's a little harder. But we do have to meet this particular action to be effective. We have to show what's possible. The reality is that people have very limited capacity to absorb bad news or information about that's not positive. What happens when they're confronted with a lot of bad news or data or problems without it being paired with at least the hope for a solution is that they start to shut down. They withdraw, they disassociate themselves from the problem. They stop caring because it hurts. It hurts to care about something that does not seem like it has a solution, that feels hopeless. But that's the state that so many of us, environmentalists, corporate folk, scientists alike, leave our audiences in. And let me give you this insight. Hopelessness does not breed action. So if we're trying to communicate science for action, we have to inspire with a sense of possibility. So here's where this starts to stray into sacred ground, both interestingly enough for scientists and for journalists. Or really for anyone who holds objectivity as their central tenet of their work. How do we paint a postcard of the destination? That's what the authors of the book Switch, which is a great resource on this topic, call this showing possibility, a postcard of the destination. How do we do that while staying objective? What does neutral look like when we're revealing possibility? And when we're talking about some of the biggest issues of our time? I know this is an issue that we all grapple with. I actually think the answer is easier than it appears. Did you notice what I did there? I gave you hope. We don't have to equate focusing on solutions with advocating for a particular outcome. Those are not one and the same. A focus on solutions, revealing a set of possibilities, a solution set, if you will, and advocating for a solution are not one and the same at all. Journalists, for instance, can report on how people are responding to social problems without advocating for a particular approach. In fact, they do this all the time, and in growing numbers, and in articles and radio shows and talk shows that are increasingly being watched and listened to. It's a field called solutions journalism, and journalists do it because they know it makes for effective communication. So what are these journalists doing? These journalists are providing information on pressing newsworthy topics while also delving deeper into things like the root cause of that topic, collaborations that might be working or trying to work on that topic, going into the problems that innovators face as they're trying to solve a topic, or telling stories about unlikely heroes like markets or economics providing solutions. So let me be clear, this type of solutions journalism faces all the same rigors of more typical journalism: accuracy, impartiality, newsworthiness, accountability. It just looks for stories in a different place. It's got a different angle. It's looking for a story where a problem is meeting with a response. So let's think about what that looks like for science. I'm not a scientist, so I can't do this for you. But at a minimum, I can tell you that I think it, at minimum, means that your job is to put the best science in the right hands at the right time and in the right format. If you do that, you're most of the way there. Moving beyond that, though, is this idea of science-based advocacy. That's a turn of phrase that I cringe at a little bit because of the association with the word advocacy. I don't actually think it's advocacy. I think it's science-based social impact. And I think that's probably what drives each and every one of you in this room. So let's look to our colleagues in the really well-respected medical journal, The Lancet, for inspiration here. The Lancet was first published almost 95 years ago, 95 years ago next week, actually. And the journal has worked, and this is their quote mission statement, to make science widely available so medicine can serve and transform society and positively impact the lives of people. For 95 years, that's been an accepted mission for the Lancet. There is likely no issue on Earth which could benefit more from science guiding us to possible solutions than the issue of water. In the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year, 2 scientists from UC Davis and Berkeley offered a framework for thinking about how science could help with the issue of water. And interestingly enough, they point out that science has already shown the possible. Science has meticulously documented the significant advantages of managing water resources at a basin level in an integrated, holistic way. Case closed, right? And yet, most of the world's water resources are not managed that way. They're managed in fragmented ways, creating conflict, ignoring the fundamental nature of the hydrological cycle, harming ecosystems, and promoting short-sighted and wasteful water use policies. So the task at hand for each and every one of you is to continue to shine a light on what is possible and do a better job of explaining and communicating and educating and engaging. Here's why. If you don't, and we really are depending on you, if you don't show what's possible, we could end up with a world that has the know-how in this room and others like it to solve the world's water crises, but yet lacks the will to do so. So let me wrap up by telling a story that provides a glimpse of what's possible for all of us in the room. Anybody heard of Dr. Jonathan Garlick? Google. Not now. Dr. Jonathan Garlick is a professor and a researcher at Tufts University. He's actually in their dental school. He's also known as the wrapping professor. His specialty is stem cells. His work, as you might imagine, has been caught in the political and ethical conversations around embryonic stem cell research. That ongoing uncertainty and fluctuating policy environment has thrown his and many other scientists' work into chaos. So Dr. Garlick wrote a blog that you can find online that shares how his curiosity drove him to deeper understanding of the political and ethical and legal aspects that have always surrounded embryonic stem cell research. In doing so, he discovered a new passion for helping the public engage in an open-minded discussion about the impact of science in their lives. That led to a groundbreaking new course for undergraduates at Tufts called Science and the Human Experience that aimed to humanize the scientists. He used whatever medium was necessary to be effective, thus the wrapping professor nickname. Dr. Garlick writes the following. Early on, it became clear that as students filtered the complex issues of science through a personal lens and had intimate discussions with their peers, their perceptions of science as a dry discipline without any relevance to their own lives was transformed. They began to understand that scientific inquiry is a never-ending and necessary process. As I taught the course, I myself learned about the value of bringing science to life for people. My goal is not to move public opinion towards one side or another of a science-related debate. My goal is to create a forum in which all sides have a voice and can find common ground. I think that's a vision of what's possible that we can all get behind. Okay, so last thing, to take you on your journey, we have one last engagement exercise. You need your smartphones again. What we're going to do is get this entire group's curiosity flowing and get you and set you up so that you can engage with the other, 700 folks who are here. So here's all you have to do. You should be old hands at this, right? You're going to text the word KNOW, K-N-O-W, which is both easier to spell than curiosity and happens to be the call letters for NPR News. You're going to text KNOW to 63735, and you're going to follow the on-screen instructions. And what you're going to be asked to do is provide 1 or 2 words, that's it, 1 or 2, follow instructions, to complete the sentence. I wish people were more curious about water and. And here's the magic that's going to happen when you do that. Can you see this? This is my water curiosity button. And for each of you that do this exercise, we're going to make one for you. And it's going to be customized for what you want to drive curiosity about. And it's going to remind you that your job is to spur curiosity. So mine says, ask me about water and engaging people. You are all welcome to do that, and I will wear it during the conference. But after talking for almost an hour, you probably have gotten almost all I have to say as well. Nonetheless, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I think we've got some time left for that now, and I'll be at our booth today and tomorrow out in the main hall. And I just want to end by saying thank you. Thank you to each one of you. When I looked through the lists of names and professions of the 700 people in this conference, I was awestruck at the technical prowess that resides here and the lives of research and inquiry that each of you have dedicated yourselves to, so thank you. I stand in service to you to help you all be better communicators and get all of the information and data and findings that you're collecting out into the world so that we can change the world together. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Amy. And as she mentioned, we do have a few minutes left for questions, which we're going to moderate with Pigeonhole. And remember, the URL for that is www.pigeonhole.at, and the passcode is MNWRC17. Pigeonhole.at, MNWRC17. And I think a few questions have already been entered, so we can switch to those now. Oh, by the way, and if you want to use an analog system, you have note cards at your table, you can write those out and just raise your hand. Somebody will come and get those questions from you. Okay, so here's the first question. Reporting likes to focus on the novel and exciting. There's little mystery left in the major cause of pollution in Minnesota, i.e. agriculture. How do you communicate the boring, unsexy causes of pollution?
So a couple answers to that question. The first is, if you go back to my survey data, let's remember that we are all probably eyebrows filled with talking about agriculture runoff and water quality in the state. But we still have something like 75–80% of Minnesotans to reach with the fact that there is significant pollution in water in the state. So the job is not done. We've saturated ourselves, but we haven't saturated the general public. So that's the first thing that I will say. I think that you saw the story that Kirsty Marone wrote with the new list that was coming out. So new research and new data can always be crafted into a story when it tells a story. And that is, I think, the case in this, that we had more lakes being listed as impaired. And so I wouldn't, don't think that it always has to be new, but do think about novel ways to tell the story and deliver value to your audience. The other thing that I will say is one of the data points that I'm really enjoying talking about, because I am saturated with ag runoff too, is the suburban and residential issues around water quality around suburban lakes with fertilizers and dog poop. Dog poop, ready-made story.
Great. Can you talk about the value of hiring communication professionals in our organizations in order to do this well?
Yes. Yes. Let me ask you this. Should communications professionals do water quality testing? I mean, what can you say? There is an art and a science to communicating well, and I do think that it's great to have pros, but I also think that in today's world, each and every one of you should consider yourselves to be pros. We need an army of science communicators. We also need a few shining stars, but we need an army.
How do you measure success on whether you've successfully engaged your audience? Any suggestions on metrics or ways to gauge whether your message has been received?
Yeah, I think this is easier than ever in the world that we live in today of two-way communication. I mean, it used to be that an NPR News 50 years ago would, be put on the airwaves and we'd guess how many people turned their radio stations on. I think that successful engagement looks like connection, and we've talked about that. And so at Minnesota Public Radio, we measure connections. We measure connections in addition to reach, and we measure connections by thinking about how many people we've engaged with on social media, in conversations, through digital experiences, through folks where we are referenced, so where our voice shows up, where people are talking about us, and you can track all of that. And again, you don't actually need anything more than a smart college student to show you how to use something like a Google Analytics dashboard to see where you're showing up. Message pull-through is a little harder. I think one of the best ways to do this is when you've got captive audiences. Like, I would love it if the survey after the conference were to ask what a few of my key messages were and see if it pulled through, because I know what I think they are, but you've got to be the judges of that. So if you have a chance to ask people afterwards what they heard versus what you said, that's always going to be the best, and you're going to get some really interesting data points around it. Again, given the two-way nature of conversation, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and other places, I think that you can see how your message is coming through.
Okay, this will be the last question. Looks like we're almost out of time. We have time for one more. What strategies can you suggest for when we prioritize our work and have to explain why they are paying for projects that are for the greater good and may not impact them very directly?
I'm stumped, because I'm actually hard-pressed to think of a project that doesn't impact people pretty directly in the field of water. I really am. I mean, when you go big enough and you think about all that is connected to water and all that is connected in the hydrological cycle, I would love for you to come pitch me a project in which you think you'd have a resident in Minnesota or a member of the legislature or whatever that wouldn't find some benefit in it. Now, there will be the issue of cost and benefits, right? And that's something that all of us have to think about in terms of how do we communicate the extreme value that we have vis-a-vis trade-offs that someone making budget decisions might have to make. But I, again, question the very assumption behind the question that there are projects in which may not affect me directly, because who am I? Well, I live in a neighborhood, and I actually live near a lake. But if you're affecting a lake across town, you can also talk to me because I'm a mom. And I'm a mom who cares about her kids being able to swim and fish in the lake that she lives near. And I know that there's a mom in that neighborhood that cares about her kids being able to swim and fish in that lake as well. And if we go even farther from that, I'm a resident of Minnesota, and I know that our economic opportunity and the fact that we have 17 Fortune 500 companies based here in the greater Minneapolis-St. Paul region is because of our water resources. So again, find me a project that doesn't have value. I don't think I could do it.
Great. And with that, thank you, Amy.
Thank you all. This has been super fun.
And